Matsumoto, Japan. A quiet residential neighborhood. It is 10:40 at night on June 27, 1994, and most of the people on this street are asleep. A van rolls slowly past a low-rise apartment building and parks. Nothing about this looks unusual. Nothing about the night gives any warning of what is about to happen. The van is pumping invisible death into the air. By morning, 7 people in the Kaichi Heights neighborhood are dead. More than 500 are sick, some in comas, and the police are about to spend 9 months blaming the wrong man. A grieving neighbor who nearly died himself, while the people actually responsible drove away and started planning their next attack. This is the story nobody tells when they talk about Sarin in Japan. The dress rehearsal, the attack that happened a year before the one everybody knows. This is Matsumoto, 1994. The Kaichi Heights area of Matsumoto in Nagano Prefecture is a quiet residential district. The kind of neighborhood where families sleep with their windows open in the summer heat. On the night of June 27, 1994, at approximately 10:40 p.m., a converted refrigerator truck drove slowly into the district and parked near a cluster of apartment buildings. In its cargo hold was a machine that had been built for exactly this purpose. A heating apparatus that converted 12 liters of liquid sarin into an invisible aerosol, combined with a fan system designed to push that cloud out into the surrounding streets and buildings. The truck sat there quietly, releasing its payload. Sarin is colorless and nearly odorless. No one smelled anything unusual. People started feeling sick in their sleep, eyes burning, breathing becoming labored, bodies seizing up without warning. Some made it outside, some did not make it at all. 7 people died that night. Among them were Yutaka Kobayashi, a 23-year-old office worker, and Mii Yasumoto, a 29-year-old medical school student. More than 500 people were hospitalized or required treatment. Among those who didn't die immediately was a woman named Sumiko Kono, who was put into a coma by the exposure. She would remain in that coma for 14 years. She died in 2008. The 3 judges who lived in those apartment buildings survived. They had been the original targets. All 3 were sickened, but all 3 lived. The people who died instead were their neighbors, people who had no part in any of this, who simply had the misfortune of sleeping in the wrong neighborhood on the wrong night. The attack was not impulsive. It was engineered in the most precise sense of that word. Aum Shinrikyo had been manufacturing sarin at one of its facilities, a computerized chemical plant that had produced at least 30 kilograms of the nerve agent before an accident forced operations to shut down. The man who developed the sarin was Masami Tsuchiya, head of the cult's chemical weapons program. He has since admitted that the sarin used in Matsumoto was produced under his direction. Hideo Murai, the cult's science and technology minister, a title as sinister as it sounds, and at least 6 other senior members organized and executed the operation. The truck was exactly what the name implies, a modified refrigerator vehicle whose cargo compartment had been rebuilt to house the aerosol dispersal system. Someone drove it into Matsumoto, parked near the judge's building, activated the machine and left. But there was a second dimension to this attack beyond the assassination attempt. By Tsuchiya's own later admission, Matsumoto was also a test. Aum wanted data. How effectively would sarin aerosols spread in an open outdoor environment? How many people would be affected? What concentrations were lethal? The residents of Kaichi Heights were, in the coldest possible terms, the experimental subjects. The deaths weren't an unfortunate byproduct. The information gained from those deaths was part of the purpose. The anonymous tip that police received afterward made this calculation explicit. Whoever wrote it said, Matsumoto was definitely an experiment of sorts. The result of this experiment in an open space, 7 dead, over 200 injured. If sarin is released in an enclosed space, say a crowded subway, it is easy to imagine a massive catastrophe. That document existed. Police had it, and for 9 months it sat unacted upon. To understand why Aum targeted Matsumoto, you have to understand what the cult was facing there. Legally, at that exact moment. Aum Shinrikyo had been acquiring land in Matsumoto, and local landowners had accused the cult of defrauding them in a series of property deals. A civil court case had been running for months, and the trial phase had concluded in May 1994. The verdict was scheduled to be announced on July 19th, 3 weeks after the attack. Aum believed, apparently with some justification, that the ruling was going to go against them, and they knew which 3 judges were assigned to the case. Those judges lived in Kaichi Heights. The plan was to kill the judges or incapacitate them severely enough to derail the proceedings. If the judges died, the case would have to be reassigned and restarted. Aum would gain time, avoid the fraud verdict, and potentially escape the legal consequences entirely. What they executed, in other words, was murder deployed as a litigation strategy. The judges survived. The verdict was eventually still delivered, but there is a second, larger answer to the question of why, and it has less to do with the real estate case than with what Aum Shinrikyo had become by 1994. Shoko Asahara, born Chizuo Matsumoto in 1955 in Kumamoto Prefecture, a partially blind former fraud convict who had declared himself simultaneously Christ and the Buddha of the future, had steered his organization from a yoga studio into a paramilitary cult over the course of roughly a decade. By this point, had a political wing, a weapons manufacturing operation, scientists developing biological and chemical agents, and a theology that framed the approaching end of the world as both inevitable and something alone could navigate. Acquiring Sarin wasn't incidental to all of this. It was central. The real estate judges were a pretext for an operation that was always also about proving the weapon worked. To understand how people end up building nerve agents for a doomsday cult, you have to start with the man who convinced them to do it. Shoko Asahara was born as Chizuo Matsumoto in 1955, the fourth son of a large, poor family of tatami mat makers in Kumamoto Prefecture. He had infantile glaucoma from birth, losing all sight in his left eye and going partially blind in his right eye in childhood. He was enrolled in a school for the blind at age 6. It is said, and this comes from biographical accounts rather than formal legal records, that he developed a reputation there for bullying other students and extorting money from his peers. Whether those specific accounts are accurate, the general shape of a young man who learned to use his position, including his partial sightedness, which gave him status at a school for the blind, as leverage over others, seems consistent with everything that came later. He tried business. He opened a pharmacy selling Chinese herbal medicines and was arrested and convicted of fraud for selling fake remedies, a conviction that, for most people, would mark a ceiling. For Asahara, it appears to have been an education in how to package something worthless as something sacred. He found religion, first someone else's, then his own. He founded Aum Shinsen no Kai in 1984, renamed it Aum Shinrikyo in 1987, and proceeded to declare himself the last enlightened master on earth. Christ, Maitreya, the Lamb of God, the vessel for surviving the nuclear apocalypse he prophesied was coming, engineered by shadowy global conspiracies. When Tokyo authorities granted Aum legal recognition as a religious organization in 1989, it had thousands of members, many of them, and this is the disquieting part, extraordinarily well-educated. Graduates of elite universities. Scientists, engineers, people who had excelled within Japan's rigorous meritocratic system and found at the top of it a peculiar emptiness that Asahara's total cosmology filled. Masami Tsuchiya, who built the Sarin, was a trained chemist. Hideo Murai, who organized the Matsumoto operation, held a doctorate in astrophysics. These were not unstable individuals acting on impulse. They were methodical, technically capable people who had surrendered their ethical judgment to a man who had replaced conscience with eschatology, who told them that the normal rules of human life did not apply to those who understood what was really coming. That is arguably the most disturbing feature of this case. It isn't difficult to explain a crime committed out of desperation or rage or mental illness. It is harder to explain a crime committed calmly, competently, and at the direction of a coherent theological framework by people who considered themselves to be acting in the service of humanity's salvation. The people who died in Matsumoto died not because they had any enemies, not because they had wronged anyone, but because they lived near the people Aum had decided to remove. In the accounting of people who believed they were managing the apocalypse, these lives were rounding errors. That might be the most chilling thing about this case. Not the violence, but the arithmetic. After the Tokyo subway attack 9 months later, in March 1995, Aum Shinrikyo was finally officially connected to Matsumoto as well. Shoko Asahara was arrested in May 1995, convicted of his central role in multiple murders, and sentenced to death in 2004. His final appeal was rejected in 2011. On July 6, 2018, more than 2 decades after Matsumoto, he was executed by hanging along with 6 senior members. 6 more were executed on July 26 of that year. 13 people in total. Masami Tsuchiya, who synthesized the sarin, was among those executed. Hideo Murai, who organized the operations, did not face trial. He was stabbed to death in April 1995 by a right-wing activist on live television just weeks after the subway attack. And then there is Yoshiyuki Kono. Kono was a machinery salesman who lived in Kaichi Heights. His wife, Sumiko, was one of those who were put into a coma by the sarin that night. He himself was sickened by the exposure, and within days of the attack, based on a deliberate leak from the Nagano Prefectural Police, he became the media's prime suspect. What followed is, in its own way, as disturbing as the attack itself. More than 100 journalists camped outside his home. A prominent historian published an article in one of Japan's major newspapers claiming, erroneously, that sarin could be synthesized from the kinds of pesticides found on Kono's property. It couldn't. But the claim stuck. He was publicly called the poison gas man. He received hate mail. He received death threats. For 9 months, while his wife lay unconscious in a hospital, Yoshiyuki Kono was the most despised man in Japan. For a crime he had nothing to do with, while the people who actually did it were preparing their next attack. After the 1995 subway attack and the investigation that followed, Kono was cleared. Newspapers published apologies. The head of the National Public Safety Commission apologized publicly. The Nagano Prefectural Police, who had leaked his name in the first place, did not issue a direct apology until 2002, 7 years after they'd destroyed his reputation. Kono has never stopped calling for accountability. He later became an advocate for people who experience what he calls media violence, the way a determined press, acting on faulty information, can ruin an innocent person's life with no consequence to anyone. There's a through line in this case that I find impossible to look away from. The anonymous tip that warned about a future subway attack. It existed in 1994. The soil samples that showed sarin residue near Aum's facilities, they were gathered in 1994 and kept secret. The legal gap that meant sarin production itself wasn't illegal yet. It stayed open until it was too late, and the man responsible for exposing the first attack was being persecuted for it, while the real perpetrators went untouched. 13 people died in the Tokyo subway in March 1995. Thousands were injured, and there was a paper sitting somewhere in a police filing system that had told someone exactly what was coming. Some warnings we only recognize after the second catastrophe. If this case has stayed with you, subscribe and stick around. Understanding the system failures behind these events, not just the crimes themselves, is how any of this becomes useful.